And I just realized if I don't have my glasses on, I can't even see the on button. Thank you, and I'm sure you've been very patient, so I'll try to be brief today. I'll ask Ms. Laura to start the slideshow. So a lot of good points have been made today, and I'll try to weave my presentation in with those. I'm trying to advance this. I don't know if I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Maybe you can do it manually. Yeah. Even the battery wore out. This has gone on so long. Yeah. So next slide, please. Not that one. There you go. So I shamelessly borrowed from Utah. I think this is a very important slide. What it shows is that the collection of property taxes, among other taxes, have grown faster than population inflation. Why does that matter? There was, at I guess one time, I don't know how long ago it was, but a rule of thumb among budget makers was that a way to view the growth of any budget or a budget that supported public services was population plus inflation. The view being that if a county or a city grew, there were more people who needed services, and then of course there's inflation. I don't totally agree with the view, but it is a benchmark, and it's one that people refer to a lot. You can make a very simple counter argument that not everyone who shows up needs a service. I think Senator Rice has made that, other people have made that. Not everyone needs, and actually Russ Hendricks needs to avail themselves of all services. But having said that, all these lines on this chart are inflation adjusted. Inflation spoiled out. Population the last 30 years, 89 to 2019, has increased 80%. It looks like my picture is covering that text box there. I don't know if that's something you can fix, but I think I'm pretty much conversant with these numbers. If not, I'll just look on my own to read them to you. So what you can't see in the text box, population has grown the last 30 years 80%. Property taxes have grown, again, inflation adjusted 131. So that's more than inflation population, obviously. What that means is that had property taxes grown commensurate with inflation population only, they would be $449 million lower, and we probably wouldn't be here. Now, did I get my math right? I'm kind of a numbers guy. I did, because if you look at the line that's orange, property taxes, back in '89, they were actually about 400 million, but this shows about 800. So yes, they were inflation adjusted. So again, if you had grown them from 89, this is in 2019 dollars, to now at the rate of population growth, instead of being 2.035 billion, which is what they were in 2019, they'd be just under 1.6 billion, 400 some odd million lower. And I think, again, we might not be here. I want to make one other point. And this isn't knocking cities, counties, taxing districts, but government expands to the capacity for which you give it money. My wife and I just sold a 2,245 square foot house, moved into a 1909 square foot, and we're amazed at how much extra stuff we had. And should we move back into the 2245 in a few years, we won't think we've had any extra stuff. We'll fill it up. And it's much easier, and again, I'll give credit to Russ on this, to proceed along at a frugal pace than to come in 2019 and say, gee, this push back and forth about court costs. I'll just, before we go to the next slide, one last thought. So we've talked about budgeting and mandates and top line numbers, but anyone who's done a budget realizes that it's the roll up of 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 things. Does a police department need, and this is what they cost, a $30,000+ BMW motorcycle, or could they get something else? Maybe the highway patrol needs those. I'm not sure a city needs a motorcycle that can go 140, for example. These are the decisions that go way beyond just mandates. You might be mandated to do traffic safety, but how you do that, how you do everything, the application of all those dollars is very important. And one thing that Howard Stevenson said to me, the Utah Taxpayer Association president who testified, I think at your last hearing or did a presentation, he said, we, the Taxpayers Association, would try to chase every line item, but he said it's better to constrain it and have the managers do that. He said, ideally, other than the legislature or citizens. And so that was one of the things behind the Truth in Taxation. Let's jump to the next slide, please. So if this committee does its work, or at least begins the process, what will that mean? What it will mean, at least in the view of the slide I showed previously, is that 10 years from now, Idahoans will save $1 billion. Well, how did I come up with that? I basically took the difference between the growth rates that we've had in property taxes and inflation, population driven, the last 30 years and extrapolated for 10 versus just growing it at inflation population, which was the slide earlier when I referred to the 450 million lower. Well, this is the cumulative savings the next 10 years. So if you grew property taxes just at the rate of inflation and population, no more, cumulatively you save Idahoans $1 billion. And that's what happens when you compound large numbers. Next slide, please. This is a little hard to see, and I think it can be seen, though, by the committee members. This is an actual document from Ada County. We do need some sort of, it's going to segue to solutions. We do need to improve the assessment process and reduce variation. So to Representative Gannon's point, if you look, this is Boise, 19 to 20, and they have the numbers sort of backwards. They show 20 minus 19, but that's all right. What it shows is within Boise, one city where we think everything's going up, and again, these are their numbers, not my numbers. What they show is they call the Eagle District. I guess that is adjacent to Eagle. Of course, Boise and Eagle are separate. The assessed value went down. Don't know why. The bench, which Representative Gannon, I believe, covers in his district, it's the worst. So what does this mean from a practical standpoint? It means the following. It means the city of Boise could keep its property tax budget flat, and if you lived on the bench, you're going to pay more. Why is that? Because the amount of your assessed value will go up more than the levy rate went down due to a flat budget. I'll say it one more time. If the budget's flat and the total market value is growing, that'll drive the levy rate down. But if your assessment goes up more than the levy rate went down, you're like, what happened? I thought you said you froze the budget. My property taxes are up, and they in fact did. You could even be in a situation where they cut the budget, because I actually did the math, 1%, and you'd still get a tax increase. This does need to be fixed. I'm going to talk about a solution. Again, I'm not assessing any blame on the assessor, no pun intended. But when you have this much variation in a growing market, it sort of begs the question, is the process the appropriate process? Next slide, please. So 2 last slides, transparency, and then I have some other rate solutions. So one of the things I liked about Utah's Truth in Taxation was the physical tax bill. You all have that presentation. And what it showed, and it's important to understand this distinction, here's your current taxes. Here's what they would be with no budget increase. Here's what the proposed budget increase. And some people who aren't familiar with this might say, well, with no change, my taxes would be the same. No, because your home assessment changes, market value changes. So I think that really would ground homeowners. Okay, the budget didn't go up, so that means, and the market value did. At least they would understand, and then they would see, and they might show up with the pitchfork, as Howard said. Why are you proposing this big budget increase, or even a small one? Because I'm looking at what it would be without that, and that's what I'd prefer. So I think it does put a lot of information on a tax bill. It's kind of a lot of print. I think it's a great idea. I think we should do something similar. Foregone balances. Boy, is that hard to explain. There's the old foregone, and then it's been changed twice, the law. to the point initially where you had to claim it, and now if you don't claim it, it's disclaimed. That's what's just changed. Huh? So somebody's thinking, well, wait a minute, they disclaimed it. Then 2 years later, they're claiming foregone. I just think we just wipe those off the books. Just get rid of them. Simplify the formula. Others have alluded to this. I think you can look at a growth/annexation piece or a base increase piece, maybe not both. We've had a lot of conversations. And this one, of course, has been beaten to death, or I should say Seth was beaten to death, but state mandates. So, and the point here isn't to pin this on anyone. It's not easy, but it's already been said. I think now we know that they're not unfunded. Perhaps they're underfunded, but we have to see the cost. Otherwise, there's no conversation. It's just a list of stuff and an assertion. So yes, the transparency as it relates to understanding the cost, but it isn't just about understanding them. So, it costs this much. You can benchmark the best practices of counties and cities. So if a county is able to do driver's licenses cheaper, you'd think the other counties might say, well, what are they doing? And that's how you get improved performance, is through benchmarking, because we don't have resources to reinvent the wheel. Final slide, and I'll stand for questions. So any of these recommendations, obviously, you can move numbers around. The first one, though, I think is very important, and it addresses this variation in assessments. Offset market value increase to lower levy rate in a taxing district. So if the assessed values of existing property go up by 8.2%, the levy that applies to that should correspondingly go down. And the benefit of that, obviously, is then you're not punishing people because of inflation on their value of their property. But I think there's just less of an incentive to game assessments. I'm not saying anyone is, but I mean, it's not going to do anything if you do that. There's some complexity in developing the appropriate mechanism. I don't want to get into that right now. It's late in the day. But I do think if you sort of take, because we have a lot of moving parts in the math, and that's what makes it hard to explain. And if you can make this sort of a constant, then it's a lot easier. I think the increase formula itself, we have places with a lot of new construction. We're in the county that does, or 2% as the limit. Now, some people would say 2 is too low, and that's a debate we can have endlessly. Russ had said voter approval for 3. I said 2.5. It is important to note, in my final closing point, sales taxes are growing year over year at 6%, with city and county revenue sharing at 11.5. So because they're getting a fixed percentage of a growing dollar amount, that's growing at the same rate. I mean, I did the math to double check it. So you have cities and counties getting, it's actually closer to 7, and that's 14 to 19. It's about 6.9% compound annual growth. So because they're getting more revenue on the revenue sharing side, I think it's appropriate that they can take smaller increases on the property tax side. Thank you, and I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Fred. Do we have any questions? Chairman Rice.
Mr. Chairman, Fred, what's the average yearly increase of percentage of population and inflation added together? Do you know?
Mr. Birnbaum?
Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Rice. I mean, obviously, it's going to vary every year. The CPI is running well under 2% right now. I know a lot of people dispute that federal number. It's probably in the mid-ones range, and our population growth has been in the low ones, which seems lower than it is, but we're growing it from a bigger base, so the percentage is going to be lower than it was, say, in '89. So I think if you added them both together, it is less than 2.5. It's probably around 2. It's between 2 and 2.5 would be my best estimate right now. I mean, pre-COVID, I don't know what COVID is going to do to CPI, but I would say low ones in the population, 1.1, 1.2, 1.4-ish on the CPI, So gets you in the 2 to 2.5 range.
Senator Burgoyne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Birnbaum, I went back and forth on whether I should just save this for the discussion later, but then I thought, to be fair, I ought to give you a chance to respond to my thought on this. I did appreciate your charts and your testimony, Mr. Birnbaum, and but two things occurred to me. Well, actually, two things. The first is this idea that the growth in the property tax is outstripping population and inflation. It occurred to me that it might ignore two things. It might ignore that if the state, for example, is not funding education sufficiently, property taxpayers vote for levy overrides to make up the difference. And if the state was putting more general fund money into education, the property tax would come down, and then your chart would look different. The other thing that had occurred to me is I became acquainted with Idaho's roads as a driver in 1971. And I have to say that in 1971, our roads were awful. I mean, they were really bad. I used to travel a state highway all the time that was gravel down a mountainside. An interesting drive. And now we have really pretty good roads by comparison. To me, very good roads. And one of the things that I've noticed is that younger generations of drivers believe these roads are really the bare minimum or barely adequate. And I look at them and I say, you know, it's just wonderful to be able to drive on these roads throughout Idaho. They're so much better. They cut off the amount of time that it takes, and they're safer. And we pay for that. And a lot of our roads are financed through property taxes. I mean, not state roads, but they are. And that there's a value that people expect because they want better that may have been driven into some of our property taxes. So I'm just wondering, did those two things get factored in to the charts that you presented to us?
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Burgoyne. Well, I think the answer is yes. And I actually want to tackle, you threw out a lot of information. With respect to schools, I don't accept the premise on the funding. And actually, even the NEA's document, which I just did a critique of, National Education Association, shows that Idaho's percentage of education, the state and local money that's provided by the state, is higher than the average. So I don't necessarily accept that premise. And then, of course, as far as supplementals, you know, we had those before the property tax change. We had the 3 mil levy, then we got the 6 cent. So there's a lot of things that changed there. So I'm not sure that you can say that that's a property tax issue. As far as the roads, and maybe I'll even come back to the schools, it's very easy to look at the high line item aggregates and say, well, we paid more, but we've gotten better roads. But unless you actually did a deep dive into where the property taxes, which went from $400 million in $89, which would be $800+ million in today's dollars, to $2 billion, where that money actually went, you couldn't conclude anything. So I don't know how much of that incremental money actually went to roads, how much of it was federal money. So, I mean, it's a supposition. And I think that's what's important, is that we create a system with transparency so that we can't get away with, none of us, making suppositions that we can't challenge because we don't have the numbers. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Follow up?
Well, just a comment, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Birnbaum, I do agree with you. The transparency is important, and we should be able to measure that, and it would be important to measure that so that we can know whether or not, if Idahoans are paying a higher amount of property tax based on the variables that you presented, whether they're getting an increased value for something like an improved road or not. I do think that's very important, and I completely support you on that message. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Gannon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Birnbaum, referring you to that same chart, I was just wondering if one of the factors in the increase in property taxes is that growth isn't paying for itself.
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gannon, I mean, that's obviously a very difficult question for me to answer. I thought you were going to say, and I'll do you a favor, you say, Chief Fred, it looks like the sales tax has grown even more and the income tax about the same amount. And I was going to segue into another point about that. Your income tax can grow, particularly if it's a fixed percentage, if your income grows. And as Alex said, the property tax is a tax on wealth. But here's why it's problematic, especially for some of the residents in your district. It's a tax on an unrealized gain. If your income goes up, nobody likes to pay more taxes, but if your income goes up from, say, 100 to 150 and you pay more in income tax, well, I mean, you're going to keep what you didn't pay. But if your home goes from 300 to 600 and you're just living in it, you haven't, yes, your wealth on paper, and maybe when you become 65, 70, 80, maybe 90, you move into a home, whatever, you give it away, you sell it. But you're being taxed on unrealized gain because you're not getting any of that in your income. And with the sales tax, you used to buy a pickup truck and AC was that was a luxury. Now it's standard and people want 6-way power seats and leather in pickup trucks. So maybe you're getting more, but again, with your house, it's getting the same services. So you're being taxed on the inflation. It's an unrealized gain. And I think that's probably, to me, a bigger issue when you say whether growth or not pays for itself. I can't look at this chart and answer that question.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's kind of what I was looking at, Mr. Birnbaum, is the sales tax and the income tax kind of stayed, well, they're a little bit, probably increased a little bit more. But the property tax goes to the local governments, which have to provide the services, which have to provide the new fire station, which have to provide the new park, and the other local services that have to be provided. And so it just seems like this would be evidence that, yeah, the property taxes have been going up like this because there's these new facilities and new expenditures that have to be made at the local level that perhaps don't have to be made correspondingly at the state level. And so so that growth does place a more significant burden on this property tax, and maybe we should be looking at something like impact fees.
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gannon, we're not opposed to impact fees, in principle. Obviously, we have some of those now. You can go to local budgets and see them. With respect to did property taxes that go to local and county governments, do they disproportionately reflect the need to cover growth versus income taxes for the state? I mean, if you look at the state funding of education, it's roughly $2.1 billion, the local $600 million. So the state, and then there's about $270 of federal. So I'm not sure I accept your premise, honestly, because unless you were to see how all the changes have driven need for services. In other words, I'm not sure I accept the premise that the growth has outstripped the need on the local level more than it has in the state level, because the state spends a lot of money on a lot of things, particularly health and welfare. So the totality of the appropriation by this body is about $9 billion, just over that. And just over $3 billion alone is just Medicaid. And the locals, other than this whole conversation we've had about unfunded indigent care, don't pay for that. So that's a huge thing. So that Medicaid has gone from a few $100 million to $3 billion in this time. So I'm not sure I accept the premise that the growth has overweighed the impact to county and local governments.
And one other follow-up.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Birnbaum. So you did an excellent job on your assessment page, and you got to the heart of our problem on the Boise bench. 11%. Some of our homes went up 40% in 1 year, and that appreciate you doing that. When I looked at an earlier presentation, the title was Property Tax Relief Without Tax Shifting. Okay? So in order to have property tax relief without tax shifting, someone has to figure out a way that there is not a disproportionate increase in assessed values and taxes in particular areas, because that's the only way you're going to have property tax relief without tax shifting. So that would seem to justify either some kind of inflation cap, some kind of cap, annual cap, like your assessed value can't increase more than 10% a year or something, or justify an increase, a very modest increase of the homeowner's exemption. Any other ways you can think of for property tax relief without tax shifting? Because if you just do a generic group property tax relief, it's not going to stop the tax shifting. We're still going to pay more this year than we paid last year, even with the flat budget, as you described earlier, very accurately.
Mr. Birnbaum.
I'll probably make this the last one just with respect to the committee's time. Well, of course, I can't leave out Senator Guthrie. He's got his light on, so maybe I should just, 2 questions. Just very briefly. So the budget drives it, and yes, you're right. There are 2 pieces you spoke to that should be acknowledged. If you make large hospitals exempt, obviously the money that they don't pay is paid by someone else, and that's something that could be looked at, just as an example, exemptions. But I did talk about in the transparency piece, reducing any incentive assessors have by offsetting the increase in assessed value with a decrease in the levy rate. Now, the challenge is just getting the right mechanism, because you can't do that house by house. But if you start capping the increase, if you believe that it should reflect market value, you're going to get there anyway. So I don't know why it went up 40%. That just seems pretty wild. But even 11% is a lot. But if you capped it at 10, as opposed to 11, maybe you would get, with 11, you get 11 then 9, as opposed to 10 and 10. If you want it to reflect market value, capping it doesn't get you there. If you want to get away from property taxes altogether because of all these problems long term, there are too many headaches and there's too much frustration, that would obviously fix the problem. But if you truncate the growth in something and say it still has to reflect market value, at some point you've got to get to that number. And all you would be delaying the pain, but I'm not sure 11 and 9 would make me any happier than 10 and 10.
Thank you, Mr. Birnbaum. We will get you to Senator Guthrie, but we've had Senator Anthony online for a bit, so let's talk to Senator Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Birnbaum. Actually, I want to thank you for your presentation. You've given, I think, one of the best explanations of the interaction between levy rates, assessed values, and city budgets or county budgets, local government budgets. And I just to make a comment on that, I mean, what you've demonstrated very clearly is that you could freeze a city budget and you will still see property tax increases conceivably. And likewise, I would submit to you that you could also see an expansion of a city budget, and with the right conditions, either see a freeze in property taxes or even a reduction in property taxes. There's just that very interesting interplay that takes place. But that's not what I'm here to visit with you about, Mr. Birnbaum. What I'm interested in is I'm looking at your slide with regard to the year-over-year increase in the sales tax revenues that that cities or local governments are receiving. And I just wanted to be clear on that. Is that including or not including the Wayfair money that's been set aside from internet sales taxes? And is that nearly 7% happening despite the Wayfair money being diverted?
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anthony, it's my understanding, I'm about 95%, but not 100. It's despite, because if you look at it, I went to the general fund revenue book, and the general fund revenue book has the actual dollars. And so I took the actual dollars in fiscal year 15 to 19, and I calculated the compound growth rate. And so I don't believe there's any Wayfair money in there. That's what's actually distributed in that column in the general fund revenue book. I see Representative Moyle nodding his head, so I don't know if he's agreeing with me or he's falling asleep, but he's nodding his head. So.
Or both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Birnbaum, and thank you for your presentation. Just to play devil's advocate for a minute on your idea to eliminate the foregone balance, and I'll have some ideas on that when we have our open discussion, but I'd like yours. So playing the devil's advocate, if I'm a county commissioner and you're going to eliminate my ability to take foregone, guess what my default position is? To take everything I can get every year so there is no paper entry of a foregone. How would you eliminate that mindset?
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guthrie, well, the suggestions I had on that last page said to eliminate foregone and then to give you as a county commissioner the growth or 2%. Now, some might say that's not enough. But here's, I think, the overarching point. And I realize you can't paint with too broad a brush. I have no doubt that there are counties and cities that have been very frugal. And that's one of the challenges when you have a state law that sort of applies broadly. But you do have a situation where, for whatever reasons, property taxes have gone from 400-ish million to $2 billion in the last 30 years. And when you see that it's growing at a rate faster than those two, I would submit to you that you bend the curve. I don't like to use the term because that's what came with the Affordable Care Act, but you bend the curve down. And so one way to address that, not only do you give up the foregone, but you have these other limitations. Do that for a few years and sunset it and force people or have a look back to come back. But I think we could, we can have these interims every year and do nothing, or we can do something that bends the growth curve for people. Granted, there are different counties in different situations, and then reevaluate the impact. But I just think the problem with the foregone right now is there's so many changes that have been made. Again, as it stands right now, if you don't claim it, it's disclaimed. A lot of people might think, well, that's gone. But they didn't realize the old foregone is still available that can be pulled forward, right, in another year. And that, I think, that's sort of like a bill that just shows up. I didn't know I bought this, and there it is. So I just think that the optics of foregone are just not good, and I think now would be a time to just disclaim them.
Follow up? Any other questions from the committee? Representative Necochea.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Birnbaum, for your presentation. To Senator Burgoyne's point, I would love to see this chart with education, with supplemental levies and bonds taken out, because we know that's rapidly rising, and I don't want to take a chart that includes that in them and then use that to kind of diagnose what we need to do to local government budgets. The other question I want to ask is about the appropriateness of using the Consumer Price Index as a measure of how fast budgets ought to be growing. The CPI tracks the cost of a basket of goods. How much does a box of cereal cost, or milk at the grocery store, how to fill up your car? The bulk of what local governments spend their money on is salaries and benefits, and we know healthcare, for example, those costs are increasing faster than the stuff you buy at the grocery store. And so I'm wondering if there are other measures we ought to maybe be looking at there.
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Necochea, with respect to your first point, the totality of supplemental levies is just over $200 million. And it was on about a 4% growth rate until something like that. And I have a whole chart on that before they added the sales tax and took away the 3 mil levy, and then it went to 9. So that I don't think it's as dramatic as you think. If you were to go from 89 to now and do a supplemental levy growth, it's a very small part of the driver. With respect to the CPI, I suppose you could use the GDP deflator. You do have a point that, the benefits piece is probably growing faster than the CPI. But one of the things that we faced, I spent 25 years in industry, because we obviously had a lot of costs too, and I was in the paper industry, and there were many years you just couldn't get a price increase. I mean, we had to look at delivering benefits differently, which often was unpopular, but you also, how you use people, what sort of systems you had, so that you weren't always coming to people like me, because I was a budget director, and asking for more money. So I do think you could consider doing this the GDP deflator. But my overarching point was to change the mindset that we can just keep increasing these budgets and at the same time mollify people who are complaining about their property tax increases by suggesting, well, the problem is we have to raise the homeowners, which this is the non-shift committee, and I applaud the co-chairman for pointing that out. I mean, I think that's the pinch. I think citizens have to understand their trade-offs, and unless you can provide them the details, they might think that they're getting the Hyundai version and not the $30,000 souped-up BMW motorcycle.
Follow up? Any further questions? Well, thank you very much, Fred. It was a very insightful presentation. Thank you very much.